There are many different strategies on how we can structure our test suites. When testing services or similar classes that contain business logic, we prefer grouping the related tests by methods, using method names as our describe blocks. In this video, let's figure out how we can test the find_one method. One problem we'll notice is that the find_one method uses coffee_repository.find_one inside of it. We'll have to make sure to mock this repository method for our test to run properly. Looking at the code here, it seems that depending on whether a coffee exists, there are two different scenarios we must cover with a unit test. Let's head back to the spec file and start by defining a new describe block. Inside this block, let's first define the success path. This part is pretty self-explanatory, but we want to name our describe and it functions with actions. As you can see, we have describe when coffee with ID exists, and it should return the coffee object. These are very descriptive, easy to read, and it gets right to the point of what exactly this test is covering. All of these names get output into the terminal when our tests run, so it's always helpful to make these names and descriptions very specific. So back to our test at hand. In our find_one method, when a coffee with a specific ID exists, we want to test if the method returns the coffee object, or in our case, the coffee entity. Let's leave the implementation blank for now. Next, let's define a test for the failure path. Here, we're describing a test for when a coffee doesn't exist, explaining in the it function that we expect the find_one method to throw an exception. Alright, with this in place, we can now start writing the test logic itself. Inside our success path test, let's add the following code. In this test, we're hard-coding a random ID and calling the find_one method of our coffee service with this ID passed in as an argument. The important part here is the actual test itself, which is that we expect coffee to equal expected coffee. There are many different ways to assert these tests. After you declare your expect, push dot, and check your IntelliSense to see all of the other great options for test assertions. Alright, so let's save our changes so far, open up the terminal, and see what Jest shows us now. It looks like we're getting the type error, this.coffeerepository.find_one is not a function error. In the previous lesson, we used empty JavaScript objects as our entity repositories. Obviously, these JavaScript objects don't have any methods defined, so it makes sense we're seeing this error. So, how can we fix it? There are many different ways of how we can mock repositories or any other classes we need to mock. For example, we could use the object.create function and pass in the repository class prototype to initialize the repository object without any dependencies. But in the long run, this isn't the best idea. In this case, TypeORM plans to remove the repository class entirely at some point in the future. They might use literal objects instead one day. Although that is specific to this situation, it shows that we need to be careful with third-party libraries and potential changes they make, and how those changes can even impact our tests. Another way would be to create a generic function that simply returns a mocked object with all the same methods that repository class provides, and then stub on these methods to manipulate their behavior based on certain conditions. It could potentially look something like this. Note that this is just for illustration purposes. There are many other methods that we didn't cover here in this mock. So let's analyze this code real quick. First, we have a new mock repository type, which represents an object that consists of some of the properties that the repository type contains as well. However, all of these values are of type jest.mock, which is a mock function provided by Jest. Then we have a create mock repository generic function that returns this newly defined mock repository class. When the type argument is not provided, it falls back to any. Just keep in mind that we're not implementing every method for repository. We could obviously add more here if we needed them for our tests. Alright, with our mock function created, Let's replace those previously used empty objects with this create mock repository function call. Great. Now for the second step. We need to make the coffee repository variable available in our test functions. To do this, let's define a new variable under where we have service coffee service and name it coffee repository of type mock repository. Now in our before each hook, let's retrieve the value and set it to this variable. Now we can move on to our test again and mock the find_one method. If you type coffee repository.find_one and type dot after, you'll see various methods available to us now thanks to Jest. Since we simply want to mock that this find_one method returns back our expected value variable, let's just use mock return value method and return expected coffee. Let's save our changes and open up the terminal again. As we can see, our test succeeds now. Great. Lastly, we need to finish the test logic for the failure path. Let's head over to VS Code again and add the logic in the other IT block. In this code, we can see that we're also using mock return value, but passing in undefined this time. This mimics a response that our entity does not exist in the database. If everything works as it should here, the service should throw a not found exception with the expected error message, which is coffee #ID not found. We're wrapping all the code here in a try catch just to make sure we capture any exceptions that will obviously occur here, since we mocked the find_one return value to be undefined. Let's once again save our changes, open up the terminal again, and see if everything works properly. Perfect! As we can see, all of our tests passed. We can see how nicely structured Jest outputs everything as well. All of our describe blocks, nested describe blocks, and it functions are all nicely indented here with their descriptions all output for us and extremely easy to read. Although we just scratched the surface of unit testing in general, the principles and concepts we learned here can be applied to almost any situation you may run into while applying unit tests to your Nest.js applications.